According to the theory of evolution, the origin and development of the universe and all its systems can be explained solely on the basis of time, chance, and continuing processes. All living things have arisen from a single-celled organism. A second and opposing worldview is the concept of creation. According to the theory of creation, everything in the universe has come into being through the design, purpose, and deliberate acts of a supernatural creator. That means this creator created the universe, the earth, and all life on earth, including all types of plants and animals, as well as humans. On today's edition of Origins, we'll be making the case for creation.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to Origins. My name is Don Chapman, and it's my privilege to be your host. It's great to have you with us today. And you know, speaking of great to have people with us, Ron Rhodes is my guest today, and he is an author of 35 books, and he is the president of Reasoning from Scripture Ministries, and really is one of the great apologists in America today. We're blessed to have him. And his latest book is a book that I want to introduce to you. It's called The 10 Things You Should Know About the Creation versus Evolution Debate. Ron, it's great to have you.
Well, thank you.
Your
it's
book
good to be with
blessed
you.
me, and I think it's going to bless a lot of people.
Well, I appreciate that. Certainly, to God be the glory.
Well, today we're going to talk about evidence for creation. And first of all, we're going to kind of dig a hole and talk about fossils, right?
Well, we are going to talk about fossils, and fossils are an area of fascination to me personally. In fact, I often talk about fossils when I'm demonstrating the accuracy of the Bible.
My kids have accused me of being one.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
But that's not really true, because tell me, what is a fossil?
Well, you know, my daughter once said, you know, I hadn't shaved one morning and my hair was kind of flying out in every direction, and she came down and said, Daddy, you kind of look like an ape today. So, you know, sometimes kids just say things, you know.
Well, listen, I'll agree you're not an ape if you'll agree I'm not a fossil.
Hey,
it's a deal.
All right.
Talk to us about fossils.
Well, it comes from the Latin word fossilis.
Okay.
Sounds like a disease, doesn't it?
It does.
Fossilis, but it actually just means dug up.
All right.
And when we talk about fossils, we're talking about paleontologists and archaeologists going out and doing digs, and they come across traces and remains and bones and impressions of ancient animals and plants. Okay. And, you know, we've discovered billions of them today. And we've discovered a lot about the ancient past by looking at fossils. And in fact, look at all of these that have been discovered. You've got dinosaurs that have been discovered in the Rocky Mountains. I'm even talking very high up. South of Africa, Central Asia, and Belgium. You've got fish discovered in California and New York and Scotland. And by the way, I discovered a fish fossil in my lawn once.
Now, where was that?
That was in Texas.
When you lived in Texas?
When I lived in Texas. So, you know, who knows? Somebody watching the show here may find a fossil in their own backyard.
Absolutely.
Marine invertebrates have been found almost everywhere. And the point that I want to emphasize to you is that we've got billions of discoveries. Is this a number you got a grasp hold of?
Well, you see, I'm a United States taxpayer, so I understand billions. But it means that we're not just dealing with a little bit of evidence. There are volumes and volumes of fossil records now to show us what has happened before.
That's exactly where I'm going with this.
Okay.
You know, the fact is we've got more than enough evidence to make a sound, informed decision that supports creationism. And so that's kind of a beginning point for us. Fossil discoveries can lead to a negative downside, I've discovered. And what I'm talking about is the fact that sometimes there may be the temptation for certain paleontologists not to be fully objective. And let me just tell you what I'm talking about. You know, very often the fact of research funding hinges on discoveries that you've made. If you don't make discoveries, you don't get research funding. And so sometimes I've been a little bit worried that some paleontologists may have maybe stretched the truth a little bit on the significance of some particular discovery and drawn conclusions that aren't really warranted only to get that research funding. Now,
So
I don't know
if, like if you want professorship at a university, you better write.
Publish or perish.
And if you want foundational and grant money to dig, you better find fossils that support evolution.
That's right. You discover or perish. Yes. And so that's something that's bothered me about all this. You know, just one example would be the Nebraska man.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that?
It goes oink.
Well, you know, yes. See, they discovered a tooth, just a single tooth.
Right.
And from this single tooth, they drew an entire ape man.
Right.
And they published this like in a newspaper, in a magazine. Well, they later discovered an identical tooth, but this time it was attached to a skull and a skeleton, and it was an extinct wild pig.
Yes.
You see. Now, how did that guy come to that conclusion, and why did it take 40 years for them to correct their mistake on that? And in fact, the sad thing is that the media won't come back and report on the corrected findings that these, in fact, were not ape men at all.
No.
You see, so that's another thing to be aware of.
That's true.
Now, what about fossils in Darwin's time? You know, I've done some study about this issue.
Give us a date on Darwin, just for the folks that aren't familiar.
Well, Darwin did his work, you know, a couple years back.
Okay.
And he came up with this theory based not just on his own research, but by another man by the name of Lamarck, and even some of the ancient Greeks like Aristotle that go back to the 1st century. So it's nothing new, really.
Right.
But Darwin popularized it. And one of the things that we find about Darwin's time is that there were very few fossils that had been discovered.
Right.
And there were very few paleontologists. Now, you know what a paleontologist is, right?
They're the bone guys.
The bone guys. They look for bones. They do digging and so forth. And the thing is, though, that even the limited number of fossils that had been discovered as of Darwin's time had no evidence to support what Darwin was talking about. And therefore, he would ask, where is the fossil evidence? If my theory is true, you'd expect to find even a little bit of evidence in the discoveries that we've made so far. But there was not a single fossil record that would support his theory. And so basically, he explained it away. He said that, you know, perhaps the fossil record is imperfect. And maybe one day we'll make some discoveries that will, in fact, point us towards the support that we need for evolutionary theories.
So he basically argued from ignorance. We don't have the evidence yet, but someday we might.
That's right. Okay. And I'd like to show you something about the Cambrian strata. This is something that I'm sure that you're already familiar with. But the Cambrian strata is a layer of rock, and you can see that there's a number of rocks portrayed here. And among these rocks, you've got different levels of fossils that have been discovered. And these discoveries always have animals and plants and various impressions of life forms that have existed during different periods. The thing that I want to emphasize to you is that if evolution were true, you would expect the very lowest layers of rock to have simple life forms, and then on the next layer up, maybe a little bit more complex a life form, and then on up the layers, you know, you'd have increasing complexity in the life forms to where you'd maybe have human beings somewhere toward the top. But that's not what we find in the fossil record. In fact, what we find in the fossil record is the fact that all of them, all life forms among the animals, basically come into being during a single layer of rock called the Cambrian strata. And what do you make of that?
Well, it sounds like that's strata when maybe the flood happened and everything was there once?
Probably, but it certainly indicates that all the animals came into being at the same time.
Certainly.
You know, this idea of simple life forms evolving into complex life forms is just not supported by the evidence. And by the way, many of the animals that have been discovered in the Cambrian strata still exist today. Now let's look at the fossil record and the key word, stasis. This is a word that I want you to remember as we examine this, because stasis basically means lack of change. Lack of change. What you'd expect if evolution were true would be a continual change from one rock layer to the next. But in fact, what we find is a lack of change. Even after the Cambrian strata, all the animals that have been discovered are essentially the same with no changes that take place. And so fossils show no slow modifications over time. This is absolutely contrary to evolutionary theory. Now, there's no intermediate forms as well. No intermediate fossil forms. What we find in the fossil records is that all creatures are fully formed. And you see the significance of this, right?
Now, let me just put this in perspective for a minute, if we could, Ron. We have billions of fossils.
Right.
We have thousands of species.
Thousands of species.
And we have no transition from any species to the other in all of those billions of records.
Not a one.
Not a one.
Not a one. There's no evidence of transition. And the significance of being fully formed is this. If evolution were true, what you'd expect to see is maybe a creature with a little stub coming out the side of the body that would one day become an arm, maybe, in like 1 billion years. Or you might see a creature with a little stub coming out of the bottom of the body that would, in 1 million years, become a leg. But you don't see that. What you see is fully formed creatures. Now, in the British Museum, one thing that's amazing to me is we've got 60 million specimens. And in those 60 million specimens in that one museum, not a single transition exists. Let's move on to the punctuated equilibrium theory. And this is one I want to spend a little time on, simply because this is the way that evolutionists today are trying to answer their lack of evidence. This may be a phrase that a lot of viewers have not really been familiar with. Punctuated equilibrium.
Again. Yes, I'm sorry.
Punctuated equilibrium. And let me just illustrate it this way if I could. If you can follow my artwork, I'm just going to draw a line up here at the top. Okay, now if this is the history of mankind, or the history of all animals, most of the time no evolution takes place, according to this new theory. Most of the time evolution does not take place. But every once in a while there's a fast spurt that takes place, a fast spurt of evolution. And basically what they say is this: when you have a group of animal creatures, perhaps some of these animals move off from the main group of creatures where they encounter new environments and so forth that causes pressure on these animals. And this environmental pressure causes them to develop in an evolutionary way and develop new characteristics and perhaps develop into new species. Eventually, these creatures move back into mainstream geological areas and they die off, and they become fossilized. And at that point, as you look at the fossil record, it appears like an abrupt change in the fossil record. But do you know what I think?
What do you think?
I think that this theory of punctuated equilibrium is basically like a huge neon sign that says, we have no evidence. We have no evidence, because it's a desperate attempt to try to explain away why there's no transitionary forms in the fossil records.
In a subtle way, they're admitting, when they're coming up with new theories like this, that they have no evidence.
It's exactly right.
Yes.
And, you know, it goes against all the evidence that we have. If you want to talk about DNA evidence or fossil evidence, it all contradicts this punctuated equilibrium theory. Now, what about DNA?
What is DNA?
You've done some study on DNA, haven't you?
Right, but tell us what it is.
Okay, well, here's sort of a good rendering of what DNA looks like. DNA basically are cells that contain the blueprints for life. The color of your eyes, the color of your hair, the color of your skin, how tall you are, your style of body, whether it's stocky or scrawny, it's all determined by DNA. And each cell holds enough data to fill paperbacks stacked 500 times as high as the distance from the Earth to the moon.
That's a lot of information.
That's a lot of information. And as we talked about...
It's amazing when you say in each cell that's there. Incredible.
Every single cell has that information in it.
Right.
And of course, the question is, where did it come from?
Right.
Only God could have put that information there. Now, what happens when DNA becomes corrupted? What happens in a mutation? According to the best science that we have, a mutation is simply a change in the DNA sequence within a gene. They are copying errors. Now, you've got a computer, right? Have you ever had a copying error?
Yes, sir.
Probably lost some data, didn't you?
Right.
Same thing happens when you have, DNA mutations. There's a copying error, and it usually results in a change in the next generation's body that was not there before. And typically, it's negative. For example, you might have a baby born without a finger or something like that. And what we find as we consult the scientists is that most mutations are harmful. You see this picture up here? Well, that's an example of what can happen with a mutation. Science tells us that over 99% are harmful and destructive. 99% of all mutations do damage to the organism. Therefore, it threatens survival. You know how evolutionists talk about how as you evolve, your ability to survive becomes better. But in fact, DNA mutations threaten survival because they delete DNA information. That's a big problem for the evolutionary theory, isn't it?
It sure is. It's really saying to us, 99% of mutations make it worse. It would take hundreds of positive mutations in a row to change from one species to another.
Not only that, you're talking about massive infusions of new information.
Right.
And that doesn't happen.
No matter the mutation, you can subtract information, but you can't add information to the DNA through mutation.
Right.
That's an incredible fact our people need to know.
Now, we move on to the theory of natural selection, which is kind of based on the information I've just shared. What about this natural selection? According to evolutionists, there is a competition to survive, and they talk about the survival of the fittest. Now, I'm not sure who you identify here with, Don.
Yeah, I was wondering why they put somebody else's head on my body up there in that picture.
I thought that this was you. Yeah.
Okay, well, that could be too.
But in any event, the idea is that those who survive the best pass on their superior traits to the next generation, and meanwhile, the weaker guys die off. The end result is evolution, and this takes place over millions of years. Now, according to Darwin, this process of evolution or natural selection is unguided and unsupervised, mindless and purposeless. There are no long-range goals. Right. As evolution looks down throughout history, it cannot determine that in a million years it's going to create an eyeball. Rather, each change in the body is a small change. For example, a little stub coming out of an eye. How would evolution know to hold on to that small change with the goal of becoming an eye in millions of years? It doesn't make sense. Only the creationist scenario makes sense. Now, we do find, according to science, that there is natural selection within species. You know what I mean by that, right?
I think so.
I think what I mean is that even within the dog species, as an example, you have different kinds of dogs that can come about. You know, you've got like the Chihuahua, the Great Dane, the German Shepherd. All of these grew out of the dog kind that God created. But, you know, the thing is that you don't find this happening in terms of one species evolving into another species. Natural selection can never produce a new species. That would violate what we know about DNA evidence and fossil evidence. So, for example, you will never see a cat evolve into a dog. And I think cats would be very thankful about that fact. Don't you think?
Well, I was just thinking that, yeah, you're right. I'll just go with you on that. That's fine.
Oh, you're not a cat lover?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
But I did notice that you put cats below dogs on that theory, but that's okay.
You know,
yeah.
I think people would argue with you on that, but
Right.
we won't get into that.
Yeah, we won't.
I want to tell you that there are parameters set by DNA that you cannot escape. There are gene pool parameters, and what I mean by that is that even though there can be changes that take place within the species, like within the dog kind or the cat kind, you will never be able to get outside the species based upon your genetic information. Your cat DNA will guarantee that you'll always remain a cat. Your dog DNA will always guarantee that that dog will always remain a dog. It can never transition into anything else.
And now that we have DNA, we don't just think that, we know that.
We know that, absolutely.
It's
it is a perfected
truth.
science.
That's right.
And there's no question about it.
That's right.
What about comparative anatomy? Do you see any relationship between these two?
No.
Well, not really. The only thing that you see in common is they both have a nose,
Yeah,
they both have a mouth, they both got eyes,
Ears.
they both got ears and so forth.
Black
and
hair.
Sometimes evolutionists try to argue that based upon such similarities, evolution must be proved. Man must have grown out of some ancestor of the ape kingdom or some such creature. But the fact is that it proves intelligent design. The fact that creatures have the same organs proves intelligent design. Don't human engineers do the same thing?
That's right.
Look at the wheel. The wheel is good for a variety of things, including little go-karts and you know, skates and cars and bicycles and all kinds of other stuff. Wheels can be used in a variety of ways. Same thing is true of light bulbs. You can use light bulbs in terms of a flashlight or a car, the headlights, or a light bulb that you screw into your ceiling so that you can see. Human engineers design things, they figure out what works, and then use it in a variety of circumstances. The same thing is true in terms of air conditioners. Aren't they wonderful, air conditioners? They work great in cars, in houses, in buildings, in television studios, I mean, just everywhere. Same thing is true in terms of glass lenses. Glass lenses work well in telescopes and microscopes and cameras and so forth. And the point that I'm making is that human engineers know how to take an item that works and then implement that in a variety of settings in order to get the most mileage out of these different instruments that they create. Now, the point that I'm making and driving up to is this. God is the divine engineer.
Amen.
God is the divine engineer. Because humans and animals have similar environments, it makes good sense to endow them with similar organs. To me, it makes very good sense. And God is very, very wise in the way he has designed us. He gave us eyes so that we could see, a nose so that we could smell. He gave us, a digestive tract so that we could eat the food in our environment. In fact, all the senses that he's given us, he has given us so that we can survive in the environment that he's placed us. And since animals are in the same environment, it makes sense for the divine designer to give them some similar organs.
Ron, that's a great argument, and I want to wrap that up with you when we come back. We've got to take a break right now, and when we do, we're going to come back and just talk about how God is the great engineer and how because he put all the different animals in the same environment, they have similar parts. That doesn't mean one came from the other. It means the same God made them. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we want to elaborate on that just a little bit, so don't you go away. God bless you.
Creation versus evolution. You weigh the evidence. Amazing DNA. It beats computers. A computer can hold billions of bits of data, but DNA, the size of the head of a pin, contains enough data to fill a stack of books reaching from the Earth to the Moon 500 times over. Now think of the billions of dollars and hours of research it took to develop the computer. No scientist would ever look at a computer and think it was a result of chance random processes. Yet these same scientists look at DNA and insist it arose through evolutionary processes. Today's guest on Origins, Ron Rhodes, is also the author of several books, including The 10 Things You Should Know About the Creation versus Evolution Debate. You'll definitely want this book for your personal library. Book orders are being taken at 214-618-0912. Ron Rhodes is also the president of Reasoning from the Scriptures and has authored other books and articles. For more information, write to Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries, P.O. Box 2526, Frisco, Texas 75034. Or visit their website at www.ronrhodes.org.
Hi, we're back from our break. I'm Don Chapman, and this is Origins, and we've had with us today Ron Rhodes, and he's made some great points for us, showing how creation has to be true and how evolution just doesn't work. Ron, you've done a great job for us today. I wonder if you'd take a minute or two here and just sort of summarize the main points that you made and maybe drive them home for us.
Well, sure. You know, I think it's important to realize that any one of these lines of evidence by itself is convincing. But when you put the cumulative weight together of all of these different lines of evidence, it becomes overwhelming in favor of creationism. You know, we talked about the fossil evidence, how there was a sudden explosion during this single strata of rock known as the Cambrian strata. It seems like all of a sudden there was, thousands of life forms there. And as one evolutionist put it, it almost looks like somebody just planted them there.
Well, duh.
Duh, that's right. God is the one who planted them there.
That's right.
We've also looked at DNA evidence and how DNA sets parameters beyond which you cannot go. Right. Cat DNA will ensure that you always remain a cat. Dog DNA will ensure that you always remain a dog. And in your case, your human DNA will always ensure that you remain a human.
Good.
And we've also talked about natural selection, how it's an unguided process. Darwinism cannot account for all the stuff that we've talked about. Darwinism cannot explain, for example, the complex human eye or the wing of a bird. Natural selection is unguided and doesn't know where it's going. Only an intelligent designer can account for things like the human eyeball and the wing.
I think complexity will become the sword on which the lie of evolution eventually dies.
I think so. The way I like to put it is that if there's one thing that can punch a big hole in the boat of evolution, it's going to be intelligent design.
Yes,
and it's going to happen. And then final, comparative anatomy. You know, the reason why we have similar organs with, other members of the animal kingdom is the fact that we have a similar designer. God is the one who created us. God knew exactly what worked in terms of human eyes and ears and so forth, and he implemented those very organs in the different kinds of animals and human beings.
So the similarities just prove we have an incredible engineer who designed us, not that one came from the other.
Exactly.
That's right. Ron, thanks so much for being with us today. You've done a fabulous job. You know, folks, I just want to tell you today how blessed I've been to have Ron, but also how blessed I am to have you with us as we look into the truth of creation and use the evidence of science to validate it. I I just want to say to you that if you have questions, I don't have all the answers, but because I'm having this show, God has allowed me to be in touch with some brilliant minds. And if you'll write and ask the questions, we'll get you answers. Write to Origins, Cornerstone Television, Wall, PA, or email us at the address on the screen. I just want to remind you, it's God's view that He made you, and that ought to be your worldview too. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 450 from our website at www.originstv.org. For a printed version, send a $5 donation to cover shipping and handling to Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.